Are you wondering why chess is more exciting than checkers? Well, for one thing, some of the chess pieces can move a lot farther than they can in checkers. Today, you get to be a rook. But wait a minute, I want to be a fireman. Okay, you can be a fireman later in life, but today, I just want you to be a rook. The rook can move in 4 different directions. The rook can go up. The rook can go down. The rook can go left. The rook can go right. And for any of you kids out there that like to read maps, that would be north, south, east, and west. The rook has lots of choices here. The rook can go just a little bit or all the way to the edge of the chessboard. So my rook can move up 1, that's possible, or all the way to the edge of the board, or the rook could have stopped somewhere in between. For example, the rook could have gone up 2 squares or even gone up 3 squares. It would have been your choice. Of course, you can't go off the edge of the chessboard. That would be crazy. In this position, I want you to try to count how many different squares the rook can move to. What number did you get? Well, if you got the answer 14, you are on the way to being a chess master. Let's count together. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's go down. 5, 6, and 7. But we're not done. We can go left, 8, 9, 10, and 11. To the right, 12, 13, 14. If you got more than 14, chances are you tried to count the square the rook starts on, and that doesn't really count. Are you ready for a challenge question? The rook is actually able to move to any square on the chessboard in 2 turns, no matter which one you pick. Go ahead, think of a square. Did you think of the square G7? Well, probably not. I was just guessing. But in any case, let's just start with G7 and see if you can make a plan to get there in 2 moves. Now, you might think to start by traveling to the right, but if you go all the way to the edge of the board, you're not going to be able to get to G7 on the next turn. So let's go back and maybe find a different way to get to G7. Instead, let's go to the right, but let's stop after only 2 squares. And if we do that on our next turn, we can travel forward and land on the red square. Was there another way to get to G7? Well, there was. I'm sure you found it. The rook could go forward and stop on the square E7, and then to the right and land on G7. Notice how I'm naming squares. I'm using the letter first and the number second. This square is G7 because it sits on the G file. That's what we call up and down rows, files. And the square also sits on rank number 7. That's what we call side to side rows. We call them ranks. The rook had 2 different ways to get to G7. Go ahead, try any other square on the board, and then see if you can figure out a way for the rook to get there in 2 moves. We'll do one more together. How about A6? Do you see a way to get there in 2 moves? Well, we can go left all the way to the edge of the board, and then on the next turn, the rook could travel up and land on A6. Let's go back. Of course, the other way was to go forward, but stop after only 2 squares, and then go to the left, and again, we land on A6. The final thing that I want you to learn about rooks, before you become firemen that is how the rook is able to capture. It's actually very simple. The rook acts a little bit like a bowling ball and runs over the enemy piece. Let's see that in action. Here I gave black 2 rooks and white only has 1, but that's okay. We're about to do a couple of captures. These 2 black rooks are on the same file, the B file. Let's have the rook on B7 travel down the board and land on the square B4. Now these 2 rooks are aiming at each other. It's like a game of flashlight tag. But using my bowling ball idea, here comes the white rook. The white rook travels all the way over, and when the white rook runs into a black piece, he can knock it over, or in this case, take it off the board. But the rook has to stop. You don't jump over the black rook, and you certainly don't keep going. Once you capture an enemy piece in chess, you always have to stop. You can never capture 2 pieces at once. Now it's black's turn. Do you see a way that black could capture back the white rook? Well, of course. This black rook could travel up the board, run over the white rook, and then he has to leave the chessboard. You just saw your very first example of a trade. Each side got a rook. Let's review what we learned today. First of all, rooks can go up and down, left and right. They can go as far as they want to, and they're able to capture by running into the enemy piece and taking that piece off the board. We didn't learn how to become a fireman. Maybe we'll do that in our next lesson. Maybe not. Now that we've learned the rook, I think it's time we double your knowledge, don't you? Let's learn our second piece, which is the bishop. And a lot of kids think the bishop has his mouth open because he's ready to eat some pieces. But before we can do some eating, we have to set the table first by teaching you how the bishop moves. Quite simply, the bishop moves along the diagonals of the chessboard. And I see two really long diagonals that the bishop is occupying. Notice every square of a diagonal is the same color. In this case, the white squares. If the bishop begins the game on the white squares, he must stay on the white squares, kind of like the shoes on your feet. Whatever color they are today, they're going to be the same color tomorrow unless you step in some mud. Let's move the bishop along, and the bishop can move one square if it wants to, or much like the rook, it has the decision. It can go further, it can go 2 squares, or all the way to the side of the board. Of course, you can't go off the side of the board. That wouldn't be possible. The bishop can also choose these 4 squares, and the bishop can go backward as long as he moves along the diagonals. We've got 3 more squares, and if you were to count really quickly the number of arrows that Fun Master Mike drew, you'd get to 13. Recall the rook was able to go to 14 different squares, but the bishop is less powerful than the rook for a different reason. The bishop can only ever touch one color of the board. The rook can touch both, so most of the time we think the rook is a little more powerful than the bishop. Let's get to moving the bishop. Let's move the bishop 2 squares. Okay, now move the bishop 1 square. Now we'll go all the way down the board. We'll stop on this square. Then we can go to the square D1, and we can keep on moving. I think it's time to learn how the bishop does some eating. I've magically added a couple of black rooks to the chessboard. Which one can the bishop run into on the next turn? Well, that's actually a pretty easy question with bishops. Because the bishop's on a white square, only one of these rooks is on a white square. So, unless I'm lying to you, it's got to be that rook. And in order for the bishop to capture, all it does is move diagonal, staying very carefully on those white squares. You land on top of the black piece, and you take it off the board. Just like with the rook, when you make a capture, you have to stop. You can't keep going. That makes it impossible to capture more than one piece at a time. Now, if we wanted to capture this other black rook, well, actually, it would be impossible even if I gave that bishop an unlimited number of moves. What? The bishop could go 1 square and then down 2 squares, and the bishop could dance all around the rook. But as long as that rook stays still, the rook might as well be invisible. The bishop cannot see the rook. In fact, if you recall back to our lesson on the rooks, the minute black gets a move, the black rook will just come over and capture the bishop. I think the next thing we should do is play a little rook versus bishop game. I'm going to call it Tom versus Jerry. Tom versus Jerry is a story of a cat chasing a mouse. Does the cat ever get the mouse? Well, I'll let you watch the cartoon and decide. But in our game, we're going to have the rook be the cat, the bishop's going to be the mouse, and as we all know, cats like to chase mice. So let's have this black rook come all the way down to the square A1, and as you can see, the rook is about to capture the bishop. Now it's time for Jerry to run away. But you know what? Sometimes you do not want to go as far as is possible. For example, could the bishop travel all the way to A6? Yeah, it could, but if it did, the rook would just back up because rooks go in straight lines and would capture the bishop. So what I would advise you to do in this position is move the bishop to a different square. Sometimes a shorter number of moves is actually better. So we're going to move the bishop just 2 squares. And again, let's have Tom chase Jerry. The bishop's in danger, but we're going to move diagonal. And let's go to the square G6. Okay, the rook can now attack the bishop again. Let's have the rook go sideways to G1. The bishop's in danger. Bishop runs away again. And you know what? Doesn't really happen in the cartoon. But let's just say the cat is having a bad day and travels up the board but stops on G6. What is Jerry going to do? Yeah, Jerry can actually catch Tom by going diagonal, landing on top of the rook. And remember, when you make a capture, you have to stop. 2 more quick notes about the bishop, then it'll be time for you kids to start solving. I've added a few more pieces to the board to show you that when you start a chess game, you're actually going to get 2 bishops, one on the light squares, one on the dark squares. And your bishops can never run into each other because they're always going to operate only on their own color. That'd be like having a left shoe of one color and a right of another color. And while that might be a bad fashion statement, it would resemble a chess game. And the last thing to talk about, chess kids, is what happens when you run into your own piece. For example, if this bishop on G6 wants to capture the rook, unfortunately your own rook's in the way. In chess, you can't jump over your own rook, even though it kind of looks like I just did it. You have to stop and land on the square right before you get to it. So this bishop could only move to the square F5. That's it. A better option would be to move your rook out of the way and that opens the diagonal if black doesn't see what's coming. Then you can capture the black rook on the next turn, and truly the bishop will have eaten another piece. I think we've had a full meal, and now it's time for you to get solving. Every good movie has a trilogy where we find out at the end who the real hero is, and we're about to do that. We've learned about the rook, we've learned about the bishop, but there's one more piece in the long-range family. That's the queen. It's pretty simple. If you combine the power of the rook and the bishop, you get the power of the queen. She can move up, down, left, right, and diagonal, making her the most powerful piece on the board, but just like your birthday, you only get one queen. We've put the queen right in the middle of the chessboard, just like we do with the last two pieces, to show you she goes up, she goes down, she goes left, she goes right. But we're not done, because she's not a rook, she's a queen. She has the power of the bishop as well, and we just learned that the bishop can move along the diagonals of the chessboard, and if you were to count up all of these squares, well, you'd be here for a while, but if you did it correctly, you'd get to 27. Now, it's not quite correct to say the queen moves wherever she wants, because there's 64 squares on the board. There's actually more squares that she cannot move to than she can move to. However, it's still the most powerful piece. Just make sure you're accurate. She moves like a rook and a bishop put together. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to highlight a square, and you're going to try to guess if she can move there. Can the queen move to this square? Yes, indeed. That is along the diagonal. Okay, let's try another one. Can the queen move to this square? Actually, that's a no. If we move diagonal, moving like a bishop, we would stay on the light squares, and she can't move there. If she travels forward again, she is not able to move there. Let's try another one. How about over here on H2? Nope, she can't quite get there either. If she moves diagonal, she would just barely miss. What about E1? Yep, she can move there. That's straight down the chessboard. Hopefully by now you have pretty good indication of her power. But how about when she wants to capture? Well, just like the rook and the bishop, she simply runs into a piece and takes it off the chessboard. We're upping our game a little bit, not just because I've added more pieces than I usually do, but because I'm going to ask you to start thinking like a chess player, which means planning ahead. What if I told you there was a way for the white queen to capture all 4 black pieces one at a time without taking a break? Well, you'd have to do a little bit of planning. So what I want you to do here is pause your video and try to figure out what is the correct order for the white queen to capture 4 black pieces in 4 straight turns without black getting to move. If you're back, that must mean you've solved it. The critical decision was the first move. If the queen comes over and captures this rook on the square c4, the question is which piece to capture next? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at it. If we capture this rook, we could move down to capture the bishop, but that would be the end of the sequence. You could instead capture this bishop and then capture the rook, but then would you really be in a position to capture the final bishop? I don't think so. Capture, capture. We're on the B file, the bishop's on the C file. That would be a miss. Let's go back to the beginning and see what we should have done. Instead, the correct way to capture was to capture the rook on the square B7. Then on the next turn, we come across and capture the bishop. Then we move diagonal, and on our final turn, we're on the C file. We're able to capture the black bishop. Now, of course, you don't usually get to move 4 times in a row. We're just having some fun, but I think we saw pretty clearly how the queen was able to capture. And here we see the white queen not being able to capture anything because her rooks are in the way. Now let's get back to a real game where we would alternate moves. If our queen wants to capture the bishop, obviously our rook's in the way and the queen has not acquired any special powers. She can't jump over things. But if we move our rook out of the way, let's just say we move our rook backward, what would happen before we capture the black bishop? Well, it'd be black's turn and black would capture us. It would be a tragedy to lose our queen, even if we got a bishop in return. So I think it's much smarter in this position to move our other rook. Again, let's just perhaps go backward. That opens up our queen's diagonal, and on the next turn, we could capture that black rook if it didn't see what was coming. Our last position is a bit of a challenge question. Can the white queen capture the rook? No way. Well, that's not much of a challenge. We know that. If the queen tries to travel diagonal, she would miss the rook. However, if I give the white queen 2 turns in a row, my question to you is not how could she capture the rook in 2 turns, because we know she can. how many different ways could she capture the rook? You're definitely going to want to pause your videos to count all of the different sequences that are possible. I hope you had your spidey senses on, because if a spider has 8 legs, well, there was 8 correct answers here. Let's start with some easy ones. We can go forward and then sideways. Okay, so through the square B5 definitely works. We'll put a red mark on that square. How about diagonal and then diagonal? Yeah, that works too. We'll put a red marker there. Okay, what about if we move down and then diagonal? Yeah, that works too. So we've got 1, 2, 3. What about diagonal and then sideways? That works. We'll put a red marker there. How about sideways and then diagonal? Again, that works. How about diagonal to this square and then down? Yeah, that works too. It's getting a little complicated, but these are the ones we've done so far. Okay, well, which ones have we missed? We've missed 2 more. We can go sideways and forward. That makes it another red mark. And our final one's quite weird. The queen can go past the rook, then come back to get the rook from the square H3, and that would be our 8th and final answer. There should be 8 red boxes on the board. The queen is almost all-powerful. If you can remember, she moves like the rook plus the bishop. Maybe you'll be the queen of the house. We just got done talking about mom, that's the queen. Let's talk about dad, which is the king. Although to be honest with you, the king is more like granddad because he moves really slowly. Nice guy, but not going to beat you in a foot race. In fact, let's have a little race. If we were to race from the bottom of the board to the top, the queen could get there all in one turn. We learned that about the queen. But the king, he's only allowed to move 1 square at a time. So it would take the king a long time to get to the top of the board. It would take him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're still not there. 7 moves. The queen's going to win a race every single time. It's not like the tortoise and the hare, where the hare goes to sleep and the tortoise wins. The queen is always going to win. Let's remove the queen from the board, and just like all the other pieces, let's put granddad right in the middle of the chessboard. The king can move any direction just like the queen, but we already said he can only go 1 square at a time. So the king can go up to the square E5, or down, or left, or right, and of course diagonal. Those are 8 different directions, but only 8 different movements. Remember, when the queen was in the middle of the board, because she can move an unlimited number of squares, she had 27 different moves. The king is not really considered a fighting piece. In fact, the king has some really special value. Once you get done with the pawn levels and move on to the knight levels, you're going to learn about why the king is the most important piece. He's actually the only piece that you can't capture. However, the king can do some capturing of his own. Let's give black a piece on the square F5. Because that piece, the rook, is 1 square away, the king can capture it by moving 1 square diagonal and landing on top of it. What about if this bishop was on the square D5? Could the king capture that one? No, it's too far away. Granddad does not go running down the street. However, the king can move sideways, and if that bishop is silly and doesn't see the danger, then the king can move and land on top of it, capturing it on the next turn. Of course, the bishop, he can move as far away as he wants to, and you can see if that bishop is looking around for danger, the king is never going to be able to catch him. It's time to move on to the little guy. We call these short little guys the pawn. In fact, in some languages, they're called the farmers. Why? Well, because they're really good workers. Now, the pawns don't seem to have a lot of power, but you get 8 of them, so it's incredibly important to become a chess master of the pawns. The pawns are the only piece that do not start on the back row. If you're the white team, they're going to start on row number 2, and if you're the black team, they're going to start on row number 7. In order to explain the pawns, let's get rid of all but 1 for each side. In this chess position, to show you how the white pawn moves, the pawn can go forward 1 square to the square E3. So I'm going to move that pawn forward to E3. Now, forward for the black team is going to be down the board because we have to pretend that there's somebody dangling from the top of your screen playing black. Hello. And down the board for him, or forward, would be this way. The pawn comes down the board. The white pawn can go move forward once more, and the black pawn can move forward, and now we reach a very special position. So far, every piece we've talked about has captured the exact same way that he moves, but not so for pawns. When a pawn is moving along, minding his own business, He goes forward, but when he wants to capture, that's when he moves diagonal. He's only allowed to go diagonal 1 square when he wants to capture. So the white pawn can move diagonal 1 square and land on top of the black pawn. If it was black's turn, black could actually do the same to white. The black pawn could go diagonal, land on top of the white pawn, and that would be the black pawn capturing. Remember, forward depends on which color you are. If I were to give black a second pawn, can you figure out which pawn white is allowed to capture? Well, it's the pawn on d5. We just talked about that. If black had a pawn on the square f5, white could also capture that pawn. Ow. What about if black's pawn was on the square g6? Could white capture? No, because the pawn is not a bishop. The pawn can never go 2 squares diagonal. That would be changing the power of the pawn. We can't do that. In this position, in fact, the white pawn is stuck. It's kind of like if mom or dad's car couldn't go in reverse. You'd pull the car into the garage at night and you'd just be stuck because it can never go backward. Pawns will often get stuck in chess. That's a normal part of being a pawn. The black pawn is also stuck. Can the black pawn go diagonal to a blank square? No, you can't capture thin air. That'd be crazy. You can only go diagonal when you are capturing. What if white had a rook on the square h4? And that rook wasn't thinking straight, and he went sideways to the square f4. Where could the black pawn move now? Well, the black pawn could go diagonal 1 square and capture the white rook. Notice that would free up this pawn to move, and the pawns would be able to move along their way. Pawns can never go backward. This pawn on the square f4 cannot go backward to capture the white pawn. It also can't go backward to the 7th row where he began. The pawn can only go forward just like the car who doesn't go in reverse. And there's one more rule we have to learn about pawns. There's a special time when a pawn can go 2 squares. When a pawn is making its very first move, it has the option of going 1 or 2. We know if a pawn's making its first move because it's on the starting row. The white pawns start on number 2. The black pawns start on rank number 7. Is this pawn making its first move? Yes. So it can move 1 or 1, 2. It is your choice. Let's have the black pawn go 1 square. You still have the option of going 1 if you want to. Now it's white's turn. Every single white pawn can move 1 or 2, except for which one? The pawn e4. He can only move 1 square because he's no longer on the starting row. You better not move 1 square though, because if you do, the black pawn would simply capture you. It's really important to sometimes move 1 and sometimes move 2, depending on what's going on. What if we go all the way back to this chess position and we give each side 1 pawn each? If it's the white team's turn, is this pawn on the home row? Yes, this pawn is on number 2, so he can go 2 squares. If you're the black team, you're also on the home row. Could you go 2 squares? Yes, but do you want to? No. If you go 2 squares, can you see what white's going to do? White will land on top of you and take you off the chessboard. So what I would do is go 1 square, and then when the white pawn moves, he has to go 1. He's not on the home row anymore, and then black would be able to capture white. Pawns have a little bit of trickiness to them, but if you can remember to move forward but capture diagonal and never go backward, you are on your way to becoming a better farmer. Chess master. Every chess family needs a pet, and in chess, we don't have dogs or cats or squirrels. By the way, who's got a pet squirrel? We do have pet horses. We don't call them horses, though. Chess masters call them knights. We get 2 knights per side. The knight begins 1 square from the corner, and the reason I like the knights the best is because the knight is tricky. He does not move in a straight line. The knight moves 1, 2, and then makes a turn. Now say it with me, chess kids. 1, 2, turn. 1, 2, turn. Do not count the square your knight starts on though, okay? We only start saying 1, 2, turn once the knight has made his first move. By the way, does that remind you of a letter of the alphabet? Sure does. Looks like a capital L. Now don't let your teacher catch you making an upside down L. Instead, that's just for chess. 1, 2, turn. In fact, the knight can make all kinds of crazy L's. Watch this. 1, 2, turn. That's right. The knight can land on the square h4. The knight can go back to g1. The knight can move here. This knight looks like a monster. He can go to all of these different squares. In fact, let's go ahead and make the knight move in the middle of the chessboard, and let's put black pawns on all of the squares the knight can move to. Believe it or not, these are all L shapes. Upside down L's, backward L's, L's lying on their back. the knight is able to go 1, 2, make the turn, and in fact, if the knight is lucky enough to land on a piece, just like a horse landing on you, it would squish you, and that's how the knight captures. So, 1, 2, turn. Now, let's put the knight back on the middle of the chessboard. We can see the knight has 8 different squares to move to. Is there something you notice about those 8 squares? Yep, they make a pretty circle to brighten your day, but what I wanted you to notice is the color they're on. All 8 black pawns are on light squares. But wait a minute, the knight is sitting on a dark square. That means if you move the knight correctly, he's always going to change colors every single time he moves. That's the opposite of the bishop, which never changes colors. And the knight has one special power that no other piece has. Just like horses in real life, knights can jump over anything they want. Their own pieces, the other team's pieces, doesn't matter. So if I put a couple of pieces in the way here, a white rook and a black bishop, that doesn't hurt the knight at all. The knight can go 1, 2, turn. Notice the knight is only allowed to capture a piece that it lands on, not a piece that it jumps over. Let's move the knight all around the chessboard just to make sure that we've become good horse trainers. In this position, the knight is going to capture 1 black pawn every turn until they're all gone. You might want to pause your videos and see if you can figure out the path before I show you. If you're back, you must have seen lots of L shapes. 1, 2, turn. First pawn is gone. 1, 2, turn. Second pawn is gone. 1, 2, turn. That one's gone. Now we're going to go 1, 2, turn and capture this pawn. 1, 2, turn and capture this pawn. 1, 2, turn. 1, 2, turn. All the pawns are gone. Knights move in the shape of a capital L. They move 1, 2, turn. They're switching colors every single time they move, and they're the only piece that can jump over other pieces. Make sure you don't capture pieces that you jump over. It's kind of like duck, duck, goose. Just pat them on the head until you land on the destination square. That's all for the knight. You now have all the chess pieces memorized, and you're on your way to being a fun master yourself.